Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to Global Compliance Panel's live webinar on supplier and internal auditing. My name is Michael, and I'll be your host for today's session. And on behalf of the Global Compliance Panel team, I'd like to thank you all for being part of today's webinar. Today's webinar is being presented by Mr. Jeff Kassoff. Before we start off, a few words about Mr. Kassoff. Jeff holds an RAC and a CQM, and also is the Director of Quality at Medivators, which is a leading manufacturer of endoscopy products. And also in his 20-plus year career in quality and regulatory affairs, Jeff has implemented and overseen CAPA systems, and also has been an FDA liaison for and participated in dozens of FDA inspections. And Jeff also has prepared responses for 483S and warning letters, and also he's participated in face-to-face meetings with FDA officials. And Jeff's received his regulatory affairs certification in 1996, and also his quality management certification in 2013. And we are honored to have Jeff with us today to present today's webinar. Ladies and gentlemen, before we start off today's session, I'd like to quickly outline today's program. This webinar is for a 60-minute duration. First, Jeff will take you through today's webinar, highlighting the areas he would cover, and then share with you his presentation. And also would like to inform all our participants that once part of today's teleconference, you've been placed on mute and would remain so until the Q&A begins. We have a couple of minutes at the end for your question and answers. But if you do come up with questions during the session, I would request you to post them in the Q&A panel or the chat messenger. And for any reason, if you do get logged out of today's session, please follow the same procedure to join in again. Now that we're all ready, I request Jeff to take it from here. Jeff?
Thank you so much for the introduction. Let me first welcome everybody to this webinar. For those of you who have not attended webinars before, I really think the only detriment, the only downside that you're going to find is that, quite honestly, we can't see each other. The way I like to address that, because it does introduce a little bit of disconnect into the communication, is at the end when we have a Q&A, if you want to turn your Q&A interaction with me into more of a discussion, more of a give and take, actual hypothetical examples, we can do that. You're my customer, and my goal is to meet your needs. As the moderator said, and as you know, today's webinar is all about auditing. Auditing of your external suppliers, auditing of your internal processes. And before we begin, let me mention one thing. Not all of us are cut out to be auditors. And what I mean by that is, as you'll see, there's a little bit of precision, quite a bit of precision actually, that goes into performing an audit, while at the same time remaining very personally involved in the system, specifically when it comes to supplier auditing. I'll talk a little more about this, but your suppliers are not your company. You have a relationship with them. So while you want to treat them as your company, realize that your findings may not result in as high a prioritization of their aspects, because you're one of many customers, as many of their activities, that is, as you would if you have a negative citation during one of your internal audits. So we'll go ahead and begin, and contrary to the title of this webinar, we're going to actually begin with internal auditing. Before I actually begin to talk about the actual audit process, I do like to spend a few minutes talking about the regulatory requirements. The section of 21 CFR that deals with internal audits is called, conveniently enough, quality audits. And you're required to do certain things here. And I do want to discuss each of these a little bit, as I said before we move on. I'm not going to read them to you. The first thing we have to do is we have to have quality audits, but not just have the audits, we have to have a procedure. It always says procedures in the regs for quality audits. So who does what they do, when they do it, how they record it, and I'll talk a little more about what your procedure should have as we move forward. The next thing we have to do is we have to conduct the audits. Well, obviously, not obviously, but when FDA comes to audit your facility, they look at two things. Now, there's many, many subsets of each of these two things. However, what they look at on the first level is whether your procedures meet the requirements of their FDA regulations, whether they impose the same requirements upon your company that the FDA does. And the second thing, again, very large thing, that the inspector will look at is whether your practices meet the requirements of your own internal procedures. This is where, in the vast majority of the cases, companies get tripped up during FDA inspections. It's relatively straightforward to write a procedure that mimics FDA regulations. You have to do this, you have to do this, and so on and so forth, and we shall do this. However, to actually comply with your own procedures 100% of the time is a little bit daunting and a little less definitive than one would think it would be. So the audits that you conduct on the quality system should meet the requirements that you pose upon yourself in your procedures. Something else is you have to avoid conflict of interest. So those who audit cannot have direct responsibility for the matters being audited. They can perform those things. It is absolutely acceptable to have, if you have an internal audit team comprised of different people from different departments, you can have an inspector on your audit team who can perform an internal audit of inspection and test status, for example. While the person performs a task, the inspector that is, he or she does not have direct responsibility for the matters being audited. Responsibility being ultimate authority, that is. It's your quality manager who you've got to exclude from performing or participating in an internal audit of test and inspection status. For smaller companies, what I advise you to do, if you have a small enough company that maybe you're a startup, for example, and you only have 20 or 30-something people, obviously you're regulated by FDA, so you want to have internal audits. It's okay to write up an explanation along with your audit report that states, for example, and I started my career at a very small startup, that states that while your quality manager will be participating in the audit of test and inspection status, the results, the audit report, and the findings will be reviewed by the CEO or by the director of R&D or somebody like that to avoid conflict of interest. In that case, what you're doing is, while you're not meeting the letter of the law, so to speak, you are certainly meeting the intent of the law. The next regulatory requirement is we've got to take corrective action. Well, part of taking corrective action is documenting your corrective action. Having said that, though, I hope all of you are aware that the internal audit reports themselves, which include the findings and so on and so forth, are excluded from the purview of the inspector's review when he or she comes to perform the inspection. So the question is, how can I show that I'm taking corrective action in response to internal audits, but not show my internal audit reports? Several ways to do this, my favorite of which is when you take corrective action, perhaps you change a procedure. On your ECO document, the governing document that contains your change, the description of your change and the references to the documents, under the reason for change or rationale for change section, put corrective action in response to finding of management and review and a date. So that way you can show in any auditor that you're performing corrective action in response to internal audits, but not show them what the actual finding was that prompted this corrective action. Well, the audit report has to be documented. If it's not documented, it wasn't done. This goes without saying, but remember that part of documentation could be review, which is a reasonable segue to the next bullet point, which speaks to the audit report being the requirement that it be reviewed by management. Even smaller companies, as I said earlier, can implement this by having the person who performs the audit having one other person in management review the performance of the audit. Even larger companies that have an internal audit team who performs internal audits on all of their locations bear the same requirement, which is to have the audit report reviewed by management. The review must be documented. Again, repeat after me, if it's not documented, it wasn't done. And the results of the audits, as well as the dates of the audits, have to be documented. So you have an audit report. It needs to contain, among other things, the results of the audits. Now, when it comes to results of audits, many firms have many different types of things. I've heard of findings, observations, opportunities for improvement. Whatever you have, whatever system you've implemented, make sure that it's in your procedure, that, for example, you say that a finding is an objectionable discovery, but an opportunity for improvement is an isolated occurrence, and corrective action is required for the former and not the latter. Something to that effect to distinguish between your types of results. When it comes to your audit team, you've got to remember that your procedure has to contain a few things. It should contain who determines the audit team, where it's chosen from. In companies that have, in significantly larger companies that is, that have internal auditors, corporate auditors, this obviously would not apply to them, but many of us are in a situation where we don't have that. We are a one facility company, and we determine our audit team, and we train people, of course, but we draw from different departments. Who determines the audit team? Is there somebody who can be perhaps dismissed from the audit team for various reasons? What are the responsibilities of each of the team members? I've seen companies that have lead auditors and assistant auditors. Now, obviously, lead auditors can perform the responsibilities of the assistant auditor. That's entirely up to how you phrase that in your procedure, but it can't be the other way around. In many cases, the distinction between the two is that the lead auditor has had external training in the performance of internal audits, but the assistant auditor has been trained by one of your lead auditors. Again, looking at the small to medium-sized company, this way you are able to have multiple auditors and only have to train half of them, let's be honest. Since every audit must have a lead auditor, you're guaranteed that the person who's been externally trained on internal audits oversees the performance of the actual audit itself. Many, if not most, companies that go the route of having the internal audit committee appoint an internal audit committee chairperson. If you don't, everybody either thinks they have ownership over the committee, of the group, or no one thinks they do. You've got to make sure that somebody has the ultimate responsibility and authority to implement changes. And you want to make sure that when you determine who this person is, that you document this determination, perhaps in one of your internal audit committee meeting minutes or elsewhere, and that your procedures state what the responsibilities of the chairperson, the internal audit committee chairperson. Well, the first obviously is the oversight of the entire program, and this is a situation where since the chairperson in all likelihood has had significantly more training and or experience than the rest of the auditors, the chairperson is the best person to actually review the audit reports, to take a look at the audit findings, and also the audit summary. Perhaps there was something in the audit summary that the chairperson believes should be elevated to either an opportunity for improvement or a finding, a nonconformance. The chairperson also selects the audit teams. Some people work better together than others. If you go the route of the lead auditor and the assistant auditor, somebody's got to make sure that there's at least one lead on each project, on each audit, that is. Also, issuing the audit schedule. The standard practice with regard to internal auditing is that every discipline, every area in your quality system is audited at least once a year. Well, is that once a calendar year? Is it at least once a 12-month period? Or are there sections of your quality system that you believe that you might want to audit twice a year? As long as you meet the requirement of at least once, and it's every 12-month period. I would hesitate to use the word annually or the phrase each year for that exact reason. There are situations where an audit may slip a little bit. Perhaps it slips 1 month. And if it slips from December to January, that's okay as long as that area was audited last February, for example. So it's critical with regard to the audit schedule to make sure of that. The chairperson also tracks audit closure. Most firms do this at their internal audit committee meetings where they report on the audit closure. But again, you've got to have somebody who owns this. This is theirs. They make sure that they certainly reach out to the audit teams to confirm that the audits have been closed, or if not closed, completed. The difference being when I am going to audit a particular subsystem, when I finish asking questions, gathering information, and writing my report, the audit is completed. But the audit is not closed until I receive the responses to my findings, along with projected completion dates, and at or slightly after that projected completion date, I go back and I confirm that the corrective action has been implemented. Distributing and filing audit reports is also another responsibility of the chairperson. There are audit reports that have to be scanned into a directory or manually distributed. Whatever your firm determines, somebody has to be responsible. Again, it's all about ownership to make sure that these tasks actually occur. And senior management may not want to know the minutia and the nuts and bolts in the internal audit, but you've got to make sure that at each management review, you report on, at least at the 10-foot level, if not closer, the results of internal audits over the course of the, let's say you do it twice a year, 6-month period. You've got to make sure that you have any information at your disposal that your executive management may want to see during this management review. To continue on with responsibility of people other than the chairperson, you have the lead auditor. Well, the lead auditor has a little more responsibility than the assistant auditor. The assistant auditor is merely, and I don't mean to minimize the impact and contribution of the assistant auditor, but the assistant auditor's responsibility is to be at the audit and certainly ask questions and gather data, but participation is the beginning and end of the role of the assistant auditor. The lead auditor leads the audit. They conduct the audit. They write the audit report. They make sure corrective actions are closed. I mentioned a few minutes ago when it came to completed versus closed. And then the lead auditor documents the audit closure. A well-oiled internal audit committee runs very well when the auditors know that once they finish their audits and write the reports or receive the corrective actions, to forward that on to the internal audit committee chairperson for inclusion into the directory. Too many hands reaching into a directory usually is asking for a problem. Other than the people who are actually on the audit team or overseeing the audit team in the case of the chairperson, all of us, many of us that is, have responsibilities during the actual audit. Well, all of the managers, for example, in many cases, and it depends how you assign these tasks, but more often than not, what I see is that it's the managers, as opposed to the supervisors or directors, who are required to respond to the noncompliances or findings, or whatever you call those types of documented issues that require a response. So the manager has to make sure that they respond promptly. Most firms give 15 or 30 days. I've seen 30 a little more often than 15 to provide a response. Make sure during training of your auditors and even reminders in passing or at meetings of the internal audit committee that they understand that they shouldn't wait till the 29th day to start their response. They should begin it when they are prepared to do so. The managers are also expected to promptly correct the noncompliances. If there's corrective action that they can implement on their own with other departments, they're obviously going to do that very promptly. However, in situations where there's it requires perhaps an interdepartmental correction, the manager can merely oversee that or recommend it. And senior management has responsibility because we have to review the audit reports and trends. Long gone are the days of the Reagan presidency and its plausible deniability. If you're an executive, usually a VP and above, you can't get away with, I didn't know that the internal audits were that bad. It's required now that that information be reported to you. You want to make sure that your auditors are trained. I mentioned this in passing just a little while ago. You want to document these requirements in your procedure. Which types of auditors need to be trained and how are they trained? Internally, externally, so on and so forth. As I recommended, I like to distinguish between the training requirements for lead and assistant auditors. I find that people who are not sure whether they want to be auditors will take a little more liking to it. If you begin them out with as an assistant auditor, they can participate and they can see what the lead auditor is doing, and to some people, it's a huge turnoff. They have no interest in doing this. To others, it's something they do want to pursue, and then you can bring them outside externally and train them to the level of lead auditor. Well, when it comes to how you perform your internal audit, make sure that in your procedure, you determine the scope of each of the audits. So there's two pros and cons here. You can look at fewer audits, or you can look at shorter audits. It's entirely up to you. Fewer audits means once a year, or perhaps twice a year if you're so inclined, you audit the entire quality system. Well, on the good side of this is I only need one audit team. It might be kind of large, but I only need one audit team and I need them to do it once. Well, the flip side to this positivity is that from a negative standpoint, this internal audit, the one a year, takes a little while. It's going on and on for a long time, and if you're like me and a member of an internal audit committee, you have other things to do. You can't be performing an internal audit for 5 consecutive days. So you've got to do it in the mornings, for example. So in the morning, I'm going to audit. In the afternoon, I'm going to perform my normal responsibility. That just makes the audit go longer and longer and is in process for a long time. Let's say you want to go to the other side. You want to have multiple audits because you want them shorter, in and out, almost from a Kaizen perspective, a lean perspective. In these situations, each audit evaluates merely one subsystem. And on the positive side, it's much more manageable to know that I'm only going to oversee the audit of this one particular section. On the other hand, though, multiple audits involve multiple inconveniences. What I mean by that is, I guess I read that and I said I wasn't going to. What that means is that the more audits I have, the more potential scheduling conflicts I have. I've got to make sure that everyone's going to be there. The manager, my assistant auditor, and usually I'd want the assembly line to be up and running. So if I do it once, I only have to inconvenience everybody once. Continuing this, in determining the scope of each audit, 2 ways to look at how I'm going to scope this out. Maybe I'll go by ISO subsystem. And if I do, that's pretty reasonable, but the thing about it is it's not, I like to use the word digestible. You can't take it out in one bite. The product realization subsystem itself is 5 full pages. The measurement, analysis, and improvement ISO subsystem is 6 pages. There's a lot to do. It takes a lot of work to separate these into manageable areas. If you go, on the other hand, and manage to the GMP section, I'm dating myself a little bit here, and I audit to what's called the QSIT, the Quality Systems Inspection Technique. Any sort of separation I might need to do here between subsystems is already done for me. And while the QSIT document, as cited here, is rather long, it's very, very beneficial. I'll talk about that, I believe, in the next slide or 2. I like to do this because this is how the FDA audits. And to the same extent, the benefits of auditing per QSIT are first off, sampling tables. The sample, the QSIT dictates to the auditor, it says, look at some number of process deviations, follow them through the process, of course, but if it looks reasonable, go ahead and move on to nonconformances or something like that. So it really tells them how many to sample. And what I like to do during my internal audits is I'll double sample what they're going to single sample. Therefore, the chances of me finding a nonconformance are that much better. Having said that, I do want to say a couple of words on finding a nonconformance. Your goal during internal audit is, to some extent at least, the desire to find problems. No quality system in operation is 100% compliant. You want to make sure that your compliances are low, and you want to make sure during internal audits that you can locate them. Because when you locate a nonconformance during an audit, it enables the responder to take that a little further and expand that into a little bit of preventive action. Therefore, perhaps finding something else that the audit did not uncover. Another benefit is that if I internal audit per QSIT, during the FDA inspection, I've already looked at those areas. I've already asked the same exact questions that the inspector is going to ask because it's there in the guidance documents. When I internal audit per the QSIT also, the personnel who I am auditing, they comprehend the questions I'm asking them. We kind of work through responses, and if they make a mistake, if they perhaps offer a little too much, we discuss that. So I'm not just auditing our quality system, I'm training my people how to interact with auditors. Another benefit is that senior management is experienced in audit requirements. The auditors do have access to senior management, the FDA auditors do. Therefore, you want to have your internal audit team have the same access. Because I've been in quite a few FDA inspections where, unfortunately, in some of them, things aren't going well. So the FDA inspector would like to speak to senior management to let them find out if they're even aware of any of this. The more I can involve senior management in my internal audit, the more they understand excuse me, what it's like to be asked questions by FDA. I can tell you also that if you do it this way, the FDA inspection will definitely proceed with far fewer problems than it would otherwise. When it comes to determining your audit schedule, it's going to be generated and maintained by the audit committee chairperson. I like to issue mine annually. If I'm going to change it midway through, I'll record that change at the internal audit committee meeting and prepare a replacement, an updated schedule. But while I prepare it, I don't really formally issue it, unless it's annually. Any change to the audit schedule should be revised by the internal audit committee upon agreement of the committee itself. The contents of the schedule it's pretty simple: where I'm going to audit, who is performing the audit, and the date on which they are performing the audit, are going to start, the audit. How long the audit takes is entirely up to the internal audit team. There's no regulatory requirement that states that an internal audit of management controls must be 3 hours, and an internal audit of design controls must be 14 hours. There's nothing like that. As I mentioned a little while back, the audit schedule has to cover all areas of the quality system. They have to be covered at least every 12 months, and I recommend you use that wording, at least every 12 months. In practice, we tend to cover the more critical things a little more often. CAPA, for example, corrective and preventive action, always a hot topic. So we look at that actually twice, if not 3 or 4 times a year. And the audit schedule also acts as a tracking mechanism. I can look at the schedule and I can see what I have done and what I haven't done yet. Preparing for the audit, the first thing the lead auditor is going to do is schedule the audit with the assistant auditor and the area manager to make sure that everybody's there who you need to be there. If they're not, you can reschedule it a few days, either earlier or later. The questions that the lead auditor determines are right there in the QSIT document if you decide to audit in that manner. That's not to say you can't use the same questions and not audit to QSIT. Also, sample quantities. How many documents are going to look at with regard to document control? How many ECOs until you determine that ECO is indeed under control? Also, you want to make sure that the area manager has free time to assist you and explain some things to you during the internal audit. This assures department operation of others as well as the operation continuing on moving forward. And you want to make sure also that when it comes to the responsibilities of the area manager, that he or she does not inform personnel of an upcoming audit. I want the area manager to be available, but I don't want the people to know that we're coming. It's good exercise for them. The auditors, the first thing they're going to do during the audit is they're going to meet with the department manager, and they're going to look at all the documentation. Sometimes if I know I'm going to be auditing CAPA, for example, as an internal audit lead, I will actually gather the procedure beforehand and look at it beforehand. I even try to encourage my FDA inspectors, when they call me in advance to schedule an inspection for several days from now, I ask them if I can send them the quality manual, the management review procedure, and the CAPA procedure. But you want to make sure that as an internal auditor, you know the procedures that you've got to follow, that your auditees have to follow, because you're going to make sure that documentation is being followed. You're going to look for objective evidence in every single case that every requirement in that procedure is being performed. You're going to review data, obviously, and not take word of mouth. If there's a document that's unclear and requires an explanation, that's okay too. Sometimes if it requires too much of an explanation, I will include that in my list of opportunities for improvement. The auditor is also going to ask questions to anybody, pretty much anyone in the department, and you want to let them do that. You want to make sure that the auditors can do that, because then the personnel know what it's like to speak to somebody who is auditing them. And the auditors are also going to include any document control implications to make sure everything is under change control, as well as training. Is training performed? As an internal auditor, what I like to do, and what I find many good auditors do, is go ahead and during the course of the audit, determine who you're speaking to. And as the audit comes to a close, save training towards the end and list those 4 people and ask to see their training records, and then ask to see how I know what they're required to be trained on. It's all great to know that a particular person is trained on 80% of your procedures, but have they been trained on everything they need to be? And also, from an auditor perspective, if a document is referenced in another document, I like to look at that. I find that I might need to actually see that. Well, the audit report has to have quite a few things. It's got to have the area that was audited, the date of the audit team members, and the policies, procedures that were reviewed during this procedure, what documents were reviewed to evidence compliance with those policies or procedures, how many discrepancies there were in the audit report, how many findings or observations or whatever you call them, and then any comments. At the time I wrote this, I was using an internal audit system that used the word comments for negative observations, but not findings. The corrective action request is a very different animal. It's got to have certain things on it. It should have, from a contents perspective, the audit team and the date of the audit, the date issued, and some sort of unique identifier, a car number, if you will, that really clarifies what's going on sequentially, and it lets other documents refer to that other document. Also, what performance was found during this investigation that it resulted in a CAPA that needs to be captured here as well. Also, the corrective action request should identify that it has been issued to the department manager, whether that's a manager or a director. It doesn't matter, he's the head of the department. And lastly, what nonconformance was found. When it comes to responding and closing, we'll take a look at that a little later on during the presentation. I recommend, as I said earlier, that since work product of internal audit is not discoverable by FDA, but we have to show them that we have performed our responsibilities with regard to internal audits, I like to have an internal audit certification. What it does is it states that a particular area was audited and who audited it, and that results were documented in an audit report dated the date of the report. And these two phrases I find really work well on audit certs. The first one I was actually asked to provide during one internal audit many years ago, and the second one I kind of came up on my own. They're here to show that what we do, to show what your firm does with distributions, and you can correct these words or use them verbatim, whatever works for you. And then the second awareness statement is that what was it that was discussed, and when will we talk about it? Will we review it in a management review? Will managers, directors, VPs be looking at that? As I mentioned earlier, there are a few policies with regard to internal audit documentation. First thing is confidentiality. You want to state that your audit records are confidential and can be disseminated with only with permission of your company. This addresses the preclusion from being able to review documents. You're able to say to an FDA inspector, one of the reasons I can't show this to you is because our procedure forbids it. Also, when it comes to location, where are the documents, completed documents located? Are they located on a particular drive and subfolder and subfolder? Are they just put in a file somewhere? However you handle that, that's got to be in here too. And how long do you keep the documents for? Do you keep them for 3 months, 3 years, whatever, 4 years, whatever you need to do from a record retention perspective? That's entirely up to you. Well, when it comes to the car response, the car is about to be closed now. The department manager responds to the car, and in it, he or she puts in their corrective action plan, what they're going to do, not what they've done yet. They should have done nothing at this point. The date of response, the estimated completion date, and he or she sends this to the lead auditor. When the lead auditor receives this card, they're going to perform a review of it, and they're going to look at the proposed action and the time frame. And they may push back and say, this time frame is far too long, in which case the submitter of the document should provide a little explanation. From a guideline perspective, I like to use 1 month for completing corrective action, unless we can't. If I have to redesign an entire product, I'm not going to be finished in a month. But that's okay, as long as I provide justification for why it's taking me so long. That's absolutely acceptable. The lead auditor, as we mentioned a little earlier, has a few responsibilities, but these responsibilities are car-specific, not validation specific. The first thing that the person does is, first thing that the lead auditor does, is that he or she verifies the corrective action closer after the estimated action date. Because if I tell you it's going to be done on September 1st and it's done on September 10th, I mean, I only missed it 9 days, but I have not passed, I have that document. That's what I'm trying to say. Also, the lead auditor, if it's not completed, is going to get a new date from the department manager. And then the actual completion date at the end of everything is documented. In some circumstances, this is going to show that your initial completion date was way off, and that's what that underscores the importance of the memo explaining why. Well, when we thought we were going to start this, we thought it was going to be a quick like-for-like component switch, but now we're finding that we need a redesign of this product. That's an example of that. When it comes to audit program awareness, you want to put some of this in your management review also. What audits were performed? Did I audit per the schedule, or did I not? Very summarily what the results of each audit were. the time frames to each car because executive management wants to know that things are being done in a timely manner. What corrective actions resulted, again in a truncated manner, and when they're projected to be done, and a list of open items from past audits. If an action item is assigned, it's got to be done by the next meeting. If it wasn't, this person will identify that that's been the case. So let's take a quick trip now from internal auditing to supplier auditing. ISO 13485-741 is the purchasing process, and as you can see here, it's skewed a little towards dependent on the item purchased, a little less than the actual supplier, him or herself. Before the audit comes, you want to make sure that the supplier audit is actually required. Don't just do a supplier audit because it's a supplier and you want to go there. There are several reasons that work the best for me with regard to whether I'm going to make the determination of auditing a supplier. First thing is that I've never been there before. That's very reasonable. The second thing is a noncompliance or noncompliance history to determine that, well, you know what, this quarterly quality data says that this component's running pretty high, so maybe we need to go there. Also, bad historical data. If you start to receive information on certs from your suppliers that there's no way it could be right, there's nothing wrong with holding them, performing a supplier audit on them. And then anything else that's very, very important. You want to document during your pre-audit activities your audit procedure, your audit schedule, and your evaluation methods. How do you know whether it passes or fails? In many cases, that's in the design control folder. When it comes to preparing an audit plan, you want to look at a few things. The first thing you want to look at is what is it that you're going to review during this, as part of this audit? Is it general quality systems? Is it something like sterilization perhaps? And what do you hope to find and what do you expect to find? The second question there is a little more humorous than actual, but it's something that you may find that you need to do. When it comes to determining who's on your audit team, just be kind of aware that you may want to have two strangers or you may want to have two purchasing people. Hey, there's Jennifer who they deal with all the time. They want her to become an auditor. Do you want to really have good cop, bad cop? That's entirely up to you. Suppliers get money from you. They're good with whoever you send them. Remember, when it comes right at the beginning during your supplier audit, you want to set the audit tone. What I like to do is periodically throughout the seminar engage the conductors, or I'm sorry, I want to consider what type of training I'm going to do up front. I want to determine what type of, as I mentioned earlier with regard to the lead auditor and the assistant auditor, how I want to train my audit team. Do I want to train them merely as internal auditors? Do I want to train them on the actual product supplied to us? So there's layers of training that you don't want people to just go in and know the regulations for sure, but not be aware of the risk associated with nonconformance of shipment of product, either functionally or damage-wise or something like that. I like to call the supplier before the audit starts. I like to make sure that it's a good time for them. I want to make sure also that my process is being performed. I don't want to say worthless, but it's far less worthwhile when I go to an auditor and I see them making products for other people. It's not that important to me, depending on how similar the other products are, of course. But for the most part, I want to watch them make my product. As a supplier, when we at Medinvators are audited by a larger company, I make sure to try to coerce them into attending when their product is being manufactured. I also want to make sure that the people are going to be there who I need to be there. Somebody from R&D, production, executive management, and QA, whatever areas need to be represented, I want to make sure that they actually are represented. I also want to tell them why I'm coming. I'm going to be honest with them. If I've received quite a few recent nonconformances or many recent nonconformances or many conformances over a long period of time, I want to tell them that that is why I'm coming. Or maybe, on the other hand, you know what, they're a critical supplier to us, so I like to get out there every year or every 2 years, and that's what I'm doing. Be as nice as possible, and supplier audit should not be an adversarial situation. If it is, somebody is doing something wrong. Before I go also, I like to ask them for some documents. I like to ask them for their quality manual, any sort of documents that apply to my particular product, maybe the assembly procedure of my product. CAPA also perhaps, but I'm not going to go overboard. I'm not going to ask for the quality manual and every document that's referenced in the quality manual. That doesn't help anybody. I'm only going for a day, perhaps 2 days if it's a high-risk, high-volume supplier. Maybe I'll say 2 days, a day and change, for example. But for the most part, I don't want to go overboard. I don't want to request every document that I'm not going to have time to actually review. With regard to a checklist, I want to make sure that I record the results of the supplier audit in a systemic manner across all of my suppliers. So I have what's called a supplier qualification survey, and I'll add specifics as necessary. When it comes to the approach, again, when I'm there, I want to reiterate why I'm there. I want to let them know exactly what I intend to look at. Don't get rid of any subtleties. Put everything out there on the table. There's a reason why they're your supplier. You want both of you want this relationship to work. They're giving you product that is both cost-effective and high quality, and you don't want to change. Don't overdress. I really have a huge pet peeve when suppliers come here and audit us, and they're wearing suits and ties. Ask in advance of arriving at the audit, what's your normal dress for Wednesday, and do that. Certainly don't underdress, but there's no reason to wear a tie and jacket. You're not there for an interview. As the audit goes on, I like to sort of discuss and mention potential issues. I've saw this. I'm not that comfortable with it. I don't want to spring any findings on them at the end of the audit, especially in situations where I've misunderstood something that's been said to me or that I've actually read. Be outgoing, be friendly. Your coworkers, you have the same interest in mind for the product they make to be of high quality so that you can sell more, so that you can order more. If they hedge a little bit, or if they not so much hesitate but give you the runaround, then it's okay to be insistent. At the same time, be as non-confrontational as possible. Remind them that it's your product they're making, and ask them again to reiterate why they can't share the test procedure with you, for example. When it comes to speaking with people there, I want to talk to everybody there. I want to talk to the assemblers on the assembly line. I'm not FDA. I'm not going to withdraw my product from them unless they're incredibly ridiculous, but they're not. If they're your supplier, they're in reasonable shape. It's okay to have somebody there when I'm speaking with the people. If I'm out on the production floor, yeah, the production supervisor can be there. That's fine. I don't want to force speculation. I don't like when the FDA does it to me, so I don't want to say, well, so you mean if it looked like this, you would inspect it in this way? I don't want to do that at all. Good rule of thumb is think about how the FDA treats you. Do the exact opposite. Also, when it comes to review of SOPs and records, this is a logical conclusion from the audit plan. I have my audit plan, and I look at related procedures to that, to the audit plan. I look at records that result from the SOPs or from the assembly documents or inspection documents that I've looked at. I don't want to randomly ask for documents. I call that a fishing expedition. I don't want to just throw my hook in there and see what procedure I can get. While I may ask questions, I want to let them know early on that if there's some propriety issues, even if there's some things I can't sign for, I can't sign a non-compete, for example. I get it. If they can't mention something to me or let me in a particular room, as long as I've seen what I need to see, I get that. That's fine. Sometimes we'll have people here who ask to take pictures, and part of me is thinking, really, you get our product all the time. Taking a picture of the production floor might not really help you that much. So what I like to do on the flip side is I don't even like to ask to take pictures when I go perform supplier audits, and that way that issue doesn't come up. At the end of the supplier audit is a closing meeting. I like to give it an hour, strong hour, not half hour or anything less than that. In many cases, you're flying out that afternoon. So there's no reason to start your closing meeting long before, an hour before you have to leave the office. And that way, if you've misinterpreted or misunderstood something, you can receive clarification. I like to try to get a senior official in the closing meeting. I don't want it to be too much like FDA. On the other hand, it wouldn't be the worst thing if they treated it with as high priority as we normally treat FDA. When I cite issues, when I have findings, nonconformances, what have you, I like to call them preliminary because I'm going to go back and look at my notes or perhaps solicit follow-up information from them, and I may decide to discard a particular issue. I like to send them a final report that I'm going to send within 1 week, and it may seem kind of ridiculous, but I like to thank the people as I leave. Everything is, I like to remind them how helpful everybody was. You know what? Even in situations where that might not be the case, that's what I'm saying to them. Well, after the audit is done, since I promised to deliver the audit report within 1 week, I want to deliver it within 1 week, or at the very least, maybe a summary report with a detailed report to follow. I want them to be able to understand how highly I prioritize the findings that I've discovered, and I equally want them to highly prioritize their corrective actions into those nonconformances. In the audit report itself, I like to have a summary, why I went, who was there, who we spoke to, and that way people are recognized at their company for speaking with us, and it kind of reiterates what happened to make us have to come here. I like to have general observations. These are my classifications. General observations are things I saw that, you know what, it's just an observation, but I can't help think that it might turn into a noncompliance one day. I don't write those words, but that's the intent of this classification for me. And then I have noncompliances, which is this thing is wrong. And I want some key information here. I just don't want them to fix it or tell me why it was wrong. I want a root cause investigation, and I want a corrective action also. And I want to make sure that they're tracking corrective action effectiveness as the time passes after the corrective action is implemented. I like to tell them I'd like a response within 30 days also. If I don't include a deadline, I'm just concerned sometimes that they'll give it whatever amount of time they give it. I need them to understand the high priority of this on my behalf. Everything always couched in positive terms also. That should go without saying. When it comes to an audit follow-up, the next time I go there, the first thing I'm doing there is an audit follow-up. I'm looking at the noncompliances that they said they fixed, and I want to make sure that they actually fix them. In many cases, they will have corresponded with me proactively in the meantime, so I've received ECOs or new documents or new investigations or things like that. So to pull everything together, when it comes to internal audit, let your people know that full disclosure is the way to go. You want to find things that you're doing wrong during your internal audits and fix them, then as opposed to finding them during an FDA audit or even a notified body audit. There should be no penalties during internal audits for noncompliance. If somebody has screwed up massively during the last several months, there should be no penalty for this at all. The beauty of the internal audit is that it's a learning experience, and it's a learning experience for the FDA audit. If you audit to the QSIT, to the Quality Systems Inspection Technique, everybody knows what's going to happen when the FDA inspector does it. And your personnel, even your hourly people, have already answered the questions, so they know exactly what to say. And when it comes to supplier audits, I like to first and foremost think of a supplier audit as a communication tool to let them know why I'm coming and to let them know what I found when I was there. And it's a relationship. I want to continually ask them, what can I do to make my requirements clearer to you? Perhaps some of these nonconformances were due to just that. So that's the end of the presentation, and I guess we'll open for Q&A now.
Thank you so much, Jeff. Thank you for that. Ladies and gentlemen, once again, like Jeff just said, if you have any questions, this would be your time. If you want to directly put forward any questions for our speaker, what you could do is you could click on the raise hand option, which is a palm-like icon on your participant screen. That way we can go ahead and unmute your individual lines and you can directly put forward your questions for Jeff. Or you could post your questions in the Q&A panel or the chat messenger. So if you have any questions, ladies and gentlemen, for our speaker today, please do go ahead. This is your time. While we wait for any questions, just want to remind you all that if you do come up with any questions after today's session as well, you could go ahead and forward those over to us, and we'll make sure your questions are sent to our speaker to get your answers at the earliest. Jeff, I don't see any questions coming up. I'll just give it an extra minute to see if you do have any questions.
Okay.
Jeff, I have a question from one of our attendees, so I'll just go ahead and unmute their line so that they can directly put forward a question for you.
Okay.
Hello, Valerie?
Hi. Yes, hello.
Yes, please go ahead.
Can you hear me? Okay.
Yes,
okay.
I can.
So I sent you a question written down, but I might just ask it out loud. So we're in a small organization of about 40 to 50 people, and the problem, I believe one of the main problems we're running into is where the management team is relatively small. So, for example, I'm quality manager, so I would also be lead auditor, but I would also be part of the management team that would issue corrective actions and review the material. How do you suggest to proceed and to assign roles in smaller organizations where responsibilities overlap?
I would remove yourself from the determination and evaluation of corrective action only for internal audits. And that way you've eliminated that potential conflict of interest by overseeing the audits and thinking that they're okay. So you're excusing yourself from that determination, and then there's no more conflict of interest.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you so much, Jeff. Ladies and gentlemen, if you have any further questions, please do go ahead. If you want to directly put forward any questions, last-minute questions, you could do so. And at the same time, just want to also remind you all that today's webinar is available in a recorded format. So if you feel that any of your friends or colleagues or anybody else in your organization could benefit from today's session, you can have them log on to our website at GlobalCompliancePanel.com or also give us a call. We have a dedicated web page for our speaker, Mr. Jeff Kassoff, so there are a lot of topics available from the past in a recorded format. So if you feel that those would be beneficial, you can have a look on our website as well. And at the same time, the feedback form for today's session is open in the polling area. So please do go ahead and share your feedback as well on today's session. They're just simple 8 questions, and they're all multiple choice in nature. So it shouldn't take you more than a minute or two before you log off to share your feedback. Jeff, I don't see any questions coming up. So we'll go ahead and conclude the session. Before we do, any final thoughts, Jeff?
Just I hope that the attendees gathered some valuable information and got what they came for. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Jeff. Ladies and gentlemen, once again, just want to reiterate, if you have any questions or suggestions for our speaker, please do forward those over, and we'll make sure these questions are sent to Mr. Kassoff to get you your answers at the earliest. And once again, I'd like to thank you all for participating in today's session. And on behalf of our speaker, Mr. Jeff Kassoff, and the entire Global Compliance Panel team, I'd like to thank you all once again, and I hope the rest of the day is a lovely one. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Jeff.
Okay, thanks now.